The Galactic Academy's Xenobiology lecture hall buzzed with the usual cacophony of clicks, chirps, and harmonious hums from dozens of species. Professor Zelthak's 7 eyes surveyed the amphitheater as his crystalline voice rang through the translators, dissecting the molecular structure of Andromedan parasites with his characteristic intensity. In the third row, Nihal's head bobbed dangerously close to her tablet, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her exhausted face. She'd been awake for 37 standard hours straight, working through her thesis on human immune adaptability, while simultaneously covering 3 shifts at the station's hydroponics bay to pay for her education. Adnan, seated 2 rows behind her, watched with growing concern as his friend's eyelids grew heavier. He knew about her punishing schedule, how she survived on caffeine substitutes and sheer determination, how she'd been turned down for every scholarship, because humans were still considered academically unproven by most species. Professor Zelthak's voice crescendoed as he described the parasite's reproductive cycle, his excitement causing his scales to shimmer. The Vorthan loved his subject with an intensity that made most students uncomfortable, and today was no exception. His volume reached levels that made the crystalline Kethari students resonate painfully, but he pressed on, oblivious to their discomfort. That's when it happened. Nihal's head finally surrendered to gravity, dropping gently onto her folded arms. A soft sigh escaped her lips and she was asleep. Deeply, peacefully asleep, right in the middle of Professor Zelthak's most passionate lecture on xenobiological warfare applications. The first to notice wasn't the professor, still lost in his academic fervor. It was Crix, a young Altarian whose species prided itself on their pack loyalty. His large golden eyes widened as he took in the sleeping human, then flicked nervously to Professor Zelthak, whose volume was somehow still increasing. Without warning, Crix threw back his head and let out a low, mournful howl. The sound cut through Professor Zelthak's lecture like a blade through silk. Every head turned, some in surprise, others in confusion. The professor's 7 eyes swiveled to locate the source of the disruption, his scales flushing an indignant purple. "What is the meaning of this?" he began, but another howl joined the first. Then another. Crix's packmates had taken up the call, their voices weaving together in a haunting melody that spoke of protection and fierce loyalty. The Altarians' translators couldn't capture the full meaning, but everyone in the hall understood the message. One of ours is in need. Professor Zelthak's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as more voices joined the chorus. The Kethari added their crystalline chimes, turning the howl into something ethereal and beautiful. The Centaurian students began a rhythmic humming that provided a base foundation, while the Delphinians contributed their complex whistling patterns. But it was when Adnan stood up, his human voice rough and untrained compared to the others, that the true power of the moment crystallized. He didn't howl like the Altarians or chime like the Kethari. He simply called out, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with quiet authority. "Professor, she's been awake for 37 hours working to pay for the education that was freely given to the rest of us. She deserves to sleep." The howling continued, but now it carried a different tone, not just protection, solidarity. Every species in that hall had heard the stories about the humans, how they'd been denied basic educational support, how they scraped and fought for every opportunity. Most had dismissed these stories as exaggeration, but here was proof, sleeping peacefully while chaos erupted around her. Proof of a species that would push themselves beyond all reasonable limits in pursuit of knowledge. Professor Zelthak's scale shifted through a spectrum of colors, purple indignation fading to blue confusion, then settling into a deep green that spoke of contemplation. His 7 eyes fixed on the sleeping human, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the way her fingers were still stained with nutrient solutions from the hydroponics bay, the cheapest possible tablet that flickered with budget processing power. Slowly, the great professor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Perhaps," he said quietly, his words somehow carrying perfectly through the continued howling, "we should consider the applications of parasitic adaptation in low-energy environments." The howling began to fade as the students realized what was happening. Professor Zelthak, the most notoriously loud and intense instructor in the academy, was adjusting his entire teaching style for one sleeping human. He moved closer to Nihal's row, his massive form somehow becoming graceful as he lowered his voice even further. His lecture continued, but now it was intimate conversational. Other students leaned in, straining to hear, and discovered something magical. Professor Zeltak was actually a better teacher at whisper volume. His passion for the subject remained, but now it drew students in rather than overwhelming them. Crick settled back into his seat with a satisfied grunt, his packmates following suit. The Cathari stopped their chiming but remained alert, ready to resume if the professor's volume climbed again. The Centaurians exchanged pleased rumbles, while the Delphinians clicked their approval. For the remaining hour of the lecture, the entire hall operated in hushed reverence. Students took notes with careful quiet. Questions were asked in undertones, and Professor Zeltak delivered what many later claimed was the finest lecture of his career, all while an exhausted human girl slept peacefully in the third row. When the class ended, students filed out in unusual silence. Professor Zeltak approached Nihal's desk where Adnan was gently shaking her awake. "Miss Nihal," the professor whispered, his scales now a warm gold color. "Please see me after your next rest period. I believe we need to discuss your thesis and your scholarship options." As Nihal blinked awake, confused by the unusual quiet, Adnan grinned at her. "You missed an interesting lecture," he said. "Apparently, when humans sleep, the whole galaxy learns to whisper." Later, as word spread through the station, other species began to understand something fundamental about humanity. They didn't just adapt to hostile environments or impossible odds, they inspired others to adapt too. They turned lecture halls into sanctuaries, strangers into protectors, and rigid professors into whispering mentors. In the end, it wasn't humanity's strength or stubbornness that marked them as special. It was their ability to make others care, so deeply that an entire classroom would change its nature just to let one tired student sleep. The Cubs had howled, and the galaxy had listened.